Welcome to CoCo Conjure. Here we talk about all things hoodoo, folklore, and spiritual journeys. My goal, as always, is to give foundation to the novice and inspiration to the advanced practitioner. If you have not guessed already, my name is CoCo. Cousin, I checked the map and I saw that folks from the northern parts of South America are listening. I even got some folks from the motherland, from Africa, that are tuned in. That is wild. And I feel so blessed. Wherever you are tuning in from, please be sure to subscribe so you never miss an episode and give me a 5-star review. I promise you, I'll earn it. Okay, what are we talking about today? Okay, cuz I realized that I almost hit 25 episodes of this podcast and never once did I actually talk about what hoodoo is. I guess I just assumed that if you found me, you know what it is. Ancestors know I've skirted the topic here or there, but I honestly never attempted to nail it down. I'm not really loud about it either. Like this podcast, I don't promote on Instagram really much or TikTok, and I don't have my own Facebook group. If you're here, it's because you know. So I thought for this episode, I would try to explain hoodoo the best way I can. Just in case this is somebody who, you want to get into hoodoo and you searched on Spotify hoodoo podcast or conjure conversations. And, I'm one of the first people you've come across or something. I don't know. So I'm going to try. What I'm about to explain is what I've learned and how I understand hoodoo to exist. I'm sure another hoodoo may explain things differently, maybe a little bit more, academically or a little more spiritually, but I'm going to give you CoCo's definition. So, hoodoo is. What is hoodoo? In an interview with Harvard Divinity School, found on YouTube, Professor Yvonne Choureau describes hoodoo as the spiritual tradition of the invisible institution. She goes on further to say, I use hoodoo to describe African American traditions as an umbrella term of healing, ancestor devotion, and protection. So, in CoCo terms, hoodoo is the homegrown spiritual healing and harming practices, along with ancestor veneration and the culture that's formed around it, of Black Americans descended from the first Blacks brought to the Americas, specifically to the United States. That was a lot. That was a mouthful, but stay with me. Okay, if I had to put it more simply, I would say hoodoo is the folk magic and religious practices and spiritual practices originating in the Black American community as far back as slavery. There you go. Our ancestors, they were treated as savages, pulled from the West African area. They were, packed like sardines onto ships, sent to a land they've never seen before. It was scary. It was daunting. It was inhumane. Some of them would have rather died. Actually, a good portion at the beginning would literally get free and jump off the ship, and they would rather drown than be taken by these white folks to some place they don't know. That's why eventually nets were installed on those ships, but that's a whole nother conversation. Once here, they were, pressed to forget their languages, pushed to use new names, forced to abandon old religious practices. But they had to survive. So even as they started to lose the threads of their African identity, like soul African identity, they were able to forge a new identity by combining echoes of their past culture, a mix of cultures really, with the influence of those around them, such as Native Americans and white Europeans. There is a layering of old school spiritual superstitions and new religious dogma that created this, new folk practice. That it covers all aspects of life, and it serves the people who believe in it, the people who practice it. If you want a more academic look, I would definitely look at Yvonne Pichereau's book or Katrina Hazard Donald's book. I think they are much better at describing that. They took a whole time to write a book, but examples of this, of what I'm talking about, practices that serve spiritually and in all aspects of life, center around the old school midwives. If you listen to the episode Grandma's Faith, my grandmother, Mother Clark, talks about her birth experience with my mom versus with my uncles. My mother is the oldest of the three. Besides the fact that the midwives of old were basically like unlicensed medical professionals, they were also versed in spiritual matters around new motherhood and birthing. In her book, Mojo Workin', Katrina Hazard Donald explains, African American midwives developed and maintained a body of evolving spiritual knowledge and information about the use of plants and other substances as they respond to the changing needs of their clientele. They collected and tested numerous folk remedies and rituals, among them remedies for diminishing childbirth pain, for avoiding birthmarks, and for treating abnormal conditions in both the infant and the mother. Hazard Donald goes on to say, in the context of birthing, she helped reinforce expectations and fulfilled them by moving the mother through the ritualized stages of birth. So in that episode with my grandma, she talks about not being able to get out of bed for 9 days and having to oil wash her hair because her body was open and she had to recover after birth. Then when the 9 days were up, the midwife and my great grandmother, they made her walk around the house 3 times. Why? My grandmother cannot articulate that reason. It was just a thing they did. It was a spiritual and practical wisdom passed on from one midwife to another, from one black woman to another, an understanding of root work and spiritual protocol to ensure the health of mother and baby. And it was an understanding distinctly found in Black American midwifery. And an understanding that was missing, for example, when my grandmother had her 2 boys outside of that cultural influence in a big city in Baltimore. Eventually, the old school practices of Black midwives were phased out with the laws against practicing medicine without a license and, scientific advancement. So if you get yourself a midwife now, they probably won't let you lay up for 9 days unless you have a medical reason to do so. Now, an enduring example of Black American folk understanding revolves around the broom. It is a basic practice in the spiritual side of hoodoo, to sweep out your space. My grandmother explained to me that when I move into my new home, I need to sweep from back of the apartment to the front and get rid of any lingering bad juju before I bless the space. She didn't say juju. She just said the nasty stuff. She learned that from the old people. That's exactly how she said it. I learned this from the old people. This is what you got to do. Now, why? Again, she can't articulate that. It's just a thing you did. Especially, where she grew up in the South, where houses had dirt paths. It was more important to keep the paths to your home clear and neat and clean. Now, Stephanie Rose Bird, author of Sticks, Stones, Roots, and Bones, traces this back to a variety of West African nations, a region, I should explain, U.S. slaves came from. She says, the Boma clan of Ijo village in River State, Nigeria, has a time of the year when costumed performers wear a mask of natural raffia and other forest materials. The The performer moves from one end of the town to another like a gigantic broom, sweeping the community clean of its annual buildup of pollution, whether it be spiritual or physical. These groups and many others throughout West Africa have a vital tradition of wearing costumes constructed of natural grasses and straw to enhance their otherworldly duties. So, the broom for cleansing, for clearing, is a link to long forgotten practices of our pre-American ancestors. In another episode called Which Hoodoo Is Which, I talk about the use of brooms to stop witches and hags from riding you. Black Americans, they jump the broom at weddings. Why? To verify that either party is not, in fact, a boo hag in disguise. Now, I'm not sure if that came strictly from the motherland, as European folklore sometimes discusses the same procedure. A lot of Celtic or Irish, somewhere up in there, folks also jump the broom, So some of y'all might think that's a bad thing. I don't think that's a bad thing. Black American culture, hoodoo, is not the same as, the various African cultures that were blended to create it. We are a diaspora of people. We will not be the same, and our culture, will not be the same because we are not a culture of isolation. We, Black Americans, hoodoo was raised up amongst other folk practices. It came to fruition under pressure and with influence. So jumping the broom is an example of blacks adopting and recontextualizing adjacent spiritual practice as it fits in with already established practices. Okay, let's talk about the elephant in the room. The Christian aspects of hoodoo is one that I talk about a lot. The deep Christian syncretism in hoodoo sets it apart from other ADRs. Sure, some Orisha and Luau traditions have synchronization with saints, but the Abrahamic God, Jesus, and sometimes the Catholic saints are deeply woven into the spiritual side of hoodoo. To get a better understanding of this, I would suggest reading Black Magic by Yvonne Pichereau. In it, she literally talks about, how you sometimes can't remove the magic from the religion or the religion from the magic. In it, she writes, early African-American Pentecostal traditions show similarities with many of the supernatural traditions that were prevalent among the slaves and their descendants. Pentecostal belief revolved around invisible forces, beings and power in the spiritual realm, and like the conjure practitioners, Pentecostalists viewed unusual events as signs of divine or satanic intervention in the physical realm. She goes on to write, Pentecostals employed techniques such as prayer, the laying on of hands, and anointing with oil as described in the Bible for healing. These practices may have revalidated older African American beliefs and the efficacy of special material objects as sources for supernatural power. So, the Pentecostal movement basically had what was already prevalent in conjure culture of hoodoo. So we could layer the two on top, basically. They had practitioners who could heal or harm, and they were using physical objects to make the spiritual healing and harming happen. The major difference between the old school conjure people and these new Christian spiritualists, Chereau would go on to explain in her book, is that the Christians claimed that their power came directly from God. And eventually, the conjure people would do the same. I would deposit that as we moved off the plantation and into the Reconstruction era, being Christian made blacks respectable. Not so heathen, not so African. Which at the time in American culture at large, right, those things would have been bad. So if it were me and I was trying to get my footing in a society that wasn't designed for me to succeed, I'd claim to be touched by God too if it meant my spiritual practices would not be demonized. Okay, so that's probably me being a little cynical. I think it's fair to say that, and I guess my takeaway as well from Sharo's book is that the Christian movement, Christian beliefs, paired with like the old school understanding of conjure hoodoo root work, kind of grew up together in a way that made them almost inseparable amongst our earlier, adopters, workers in hoodoo. Not for all, but for some, for most. So that's why, you get light a brown candle, say this prayer 9 times, read this psalm 9 times, because there is no difference between Christian practice and black folk magic when you are a black Christian. Like you're employing techniques from the folk magic and mixing it with your faith. And that's, it's doable and it works for some. So why not? Again, this practice of hoodoo is not one of isolation. There are going to be heavy influences. Now, for those of us returning and incorporating the old spiritual practices in our lives, we don't necessarily do that anymore. We don't do that synchronization of Christian practice and hoodoo. We don't believe or incorporate, that system for various reasons. Now, I'm sure some traditional hoodoos out there would say that it ain't hoodoo without the Bible. We've talked about that before, and that's all right, like whatever. But for those of us just now finding our way into hoodoo, sometimes we're finding our way there because of religious trauma, and we're denouncing some key tenets such as the Bible work and the prayer cloths, the holy oil, things like that, while undertaking hoodoo spiritual practices. Others simply just don't believe the narrative that Jesus is the only path to spiritual wellness or even the duality of heaven and hell. So, there's that. Because of this, new practitioners will engage with hoodoo as a standalone practice, kind of like an ethno-religion. And that's possible as the practices include things such as ancestor veneration or the calling upon spirits that have been cultivated, on American soil, such as Stagger Lee or High John the Conqueror. Other times, hoodoo is used as a spiritual boost or a stepping stone with other religious practices, such as maybe the European pagan practices or other African-derived religions. So there's that. I should say, it should be said, however, that the Christian religion of our ancestors should be respected for what it was to them. And, it was a hope and a powerful force to overcome disadvantages for simply being born black at the wrong time, in the wrong place. This new approach to hoodoo that I just described, I refer to that as modern hoodoo practices. If you've been here before, you've heard me talk about modern hoodoo. It's not quite the hoodoo of our grandparents, and definitely not a one-for-one practice of our ancestors from the plantation and beyond. Often modern hoodoos are trying to recapture that old school spiritual experience, but they're also influenced with internet culture. And when you add internet culture, things change and it opens hoodoos up to, other occult practices and languages not said in the older eras of hoodoo, in the older styles of hoodoo. Words like energy or manifestation. That's not something anyone from our grandma's generation or beyond who's a black person practicing hoodoo would ever say. Energy, and manifestation. Those are terms that were newly added into the hoodoo space, if you ask me. A traditionalist, for example, would just say spiritual work, or spiritual power. It's not energy, not spells, not manifestation. There's also a very heavy emphasis on ancestor veneration in modern hoodoo, more so perhaps than in other eras of hoodoo, because we are pulling away a little bit from Christian practices. Also because, the modern hoodoo, they're missing a link of someone who knows, someone who understands to teach them. They're missing, the familial or the mentorship, like that tie, that connection to hoodoo. So they go to the internet, they read books, things like that, to gather information that was lost to them. It's just so they can reconstruct a practice as best as they can. Now, the hoodoo style that was practiced after the World Wars and the second migration of Black people across the United States, but before the dawn of the internet, I call it traditional hoodoo. I get that era from Katrina Hazard Donald's book. She breaks the book up into plantation, work, and then she tries to find the shift between when it became like its own religion, when hoodoo was its own thing, and then when it kind of grew or morphed into something else. So I'm using her terms. I don't think her and I use exactly the same timeline, but it's close enough. So yeah, the traditional style was practiced after the World Wars and the second migration of Black people across the United States, but before internet, before dial-up, before AOL. Examples of this style are and the practices of it. They're captured by Zora Neale Hurston or Harry Hyatt. In her book Mojo Workin', Katrina Hazard Donald describes this as the time when hoodoo became commercialized. We're no longer dealing with midwives. They had to pass a standardized assessment by the medical community, so they're not practicing the same as they used to, plantation to before the World Wars. And there's wealth. There's a little wealth. There's job opportunities. So Blacks had enough wealth to go to the store and buy a pink candle to do love work, or go to, their conjure person to pay for work to be done. Eventually, that turned into using commercial products in the practice, like the at-home practice. Like Hoyt's Cologne, for example, or Florida Water. Those are commercial products. Those were on the market and then adopted into hoodoo. And, if we're buying products, that means there needs to be a marketplace. Now you would go on Amazon, you would go on Etsy. There's at least 800,000 people practicing hoodoo online who have a website and a commerce page, and they're selling you some, bend over oil. Like you need a marketplace, right? Back then in the traditional era, usually that marketplace would be mail-in catalogs or occult shops. Neither of which, the mail-in catalog or the shop, were usually run by actual Black folks. This commercialization also means a sort of like standardization of the practice, and terms like open road or blockbuster or clear and cut are being used, because if you label it, you can sell it, right? If you say this is a road opening candle, now I can sell you a road opening candle. If you say this is domination oil, now I can sell you domination oil. You see what I'm saying? You also see the emergence of dream books and the number running, or black lotteries. If you don't know what numbers are, it's the black lottery. You also start to see an incorporation of Eastern spiritual practices, or at least the appearance of Eastern spiritual practices. Now, I am one to preach that we should uncommercialize our practice as modern hoodoos, that we should step back into, the ancestors' work and create if we can. But I have to say, I don't think that the commercialization of the practice diminished anything. I believe that it gave it like a new identity. It gave hoodoo a new identity of sorts. And it helped to distinguish it amongst other occult practices. Now that, it's accessible to anyone. Anybody can walk into this shop. Anybody can order from this catalog, Yeah. There are still traditional workers around, traditional hoodoos around. You can tell they're traditional because they say stuff like, I'm a worker, right? Or they say stuff like, you got to set the lights. You have to set your table. We're going to do some clearance work. That kind of lingo kind of grew out of that era, and it's still holding on. It means something. It means something if you're taught by an old school worker like that, because it means you come from a lineage of old school workers, perhaps even dating back to days on the plantation. And that's also a good distinguisher between your modern hoodoo and your traditionalist. The modern hoodoo, again, is using internet resources. They're reconstructing. Your traditionalist is pulling from, an oral tradition that was lost or inaccessible to a modern hoodoo, for example. So yeah, that's how traditional hoodoo is still around. It's being passed from person to person. Or I hate to say this, or you can go online and join somebody's Patreon, and I'm sure some traditional hoodoo will teach you. You know what I mean? Like, if you can't find somebody in your community, you can definitely find somebody on Patreon. Trust me. So yeah, that's traditional hoodoo. So the oldest form of hoodoo, how I understand it at least, is practiced on plantations. Like, we're talking Jim Crow era Reconstruction, enslavement, the before times. That's plantation style hoodoo, as I guess the name plantation style would give away. That's the era of spiritual practices of those who were enslaved, like I said, and like maybe a generation removed from the plantation. Nowadays online, there's a lot of mixing of people saying, like, people mix up plantation style and traditional style. Like, for example, they'll say stuff like, just use a white candle. Our enslaved ancestors didn't have pink candles, so don't hold yourself to it. I mean, that's probably true. They didn't have pink candles, but it's also just as true to say that they didn't have candles. Candles were expensive and labor intensive. These ancestors didn't have money to keep buying candles, and let alone burn them for spiritual work, So they either made the candles, taper candles, definitely not the commercialized ones with a picture of High John on the front and the candle is purple. They didn't do that. Or they used oil lamps. It's probably more likely that if they were going to use flames, they used an oil lamp or, the fire in the fireplace, that kind of thing. We're talking about the pre-commercialization of hoodoo. So to get what you need, you either had to have a supply chain, like a midwife who could get you access to a placenta, or you had to know how to grow it yourself, make it yourself, or find it yourself, which, is what I'm trying to do. I'm trying to recapture a little bit of that plantation style. I have a balcony full of herbs and fruits and vegetables. When I need something, I try to think to myself, can I go out to, my nearest, state park and find it? Does it grow naturally around me? Like, I try to ask those questions first before I attempt to buy anything. I'm also big at, swapping. If my sister has this or if I have that, we'll swap around. Or I go to witch meetups. Yes, that's right. Witch meetups, not hoodoo meetups, witch meetups. And they might have, some herb or some root or something like that. And we can swap things around. Like, I have this, you have that, let's swap. So like, you build yourself a little network if you can, which is nice. My little nod to plantation style hoodoo. So what else do you need to know? The last thing you'd probably need to know is that sometimes hoodoo is referred to as root work or conjure. Now, online discourse will tell you that these terms are not interchangeable. Conjure deals with the spiritual matters, and root work deals with the use of natural world, like stuff, things you can touch to cure ailments. And hoodoo, in turn, becomes the culture that surrounds all of it. However, it should be noted that in most historical and academic texts, the terms are usually interchangeable. Right? Hoodoo, conjure, root work, interchangeable most of the time. And when they are referred to, you are going to hear them in not such a favorable light. For example, when someone says they've been hoodooed or they've been rooted or, something like that, especially the rooted, they got rooted, they're talking about the darker aspects of the practice. And if you ask your grandma or your auntie or your uncle or whoever about hoodoo, they're probably not going to know what you're talking about. Right? Like, they're probably going to think you're talking about voodoo, right? Because those practices were just things they did. It was a part of their culture. There was no name for it unless you were the hoodoo person or the conjure person, right? Whatever you call it, however you refer to it, if you take up the mantle of a conjure man or a root woman or whatever, you have to be called to it. Sometimes the call comes at birth. It's noted by special phenomena such as being born as the seventh child of the seventh child, or being born with a caul over your head. Or maybe an old school worker sees power in you and decides to crown you with their mojo, their spiritual power, and share their lineage of knowledge with you. Or you felt the tug at your spirit and you went to the crossroad and you sold yourself to the spirit that resides there. Regardless, if you decide to take up the mantle and be a wise, cunning person in the community, someone that others go to, that requires some sort of a call. Otherwise, you're on the fringe and you're a part of hoodoo culture, not necessarily, the one to go to. Yeah. So whether traditional, modern, or plantation style, hoodoo is tied together by the Black American experience. It's tied together by the culture. These experiences include superstitions, literature, music, dance, political progression, spiritual or faith healing. It's in the food preparation and so much more. It's built off the spiritual aptitude of the first Black Americans. And I think what some people forget is that it's a living spiritual practice. It's the passing on of culture that gives hoodoo its life. Yeah. By no means is Blackness a monolith, but these types of shared experiences that we have that are weaved into our culture, they're the lingering effects of an old school spiritual practice, right? For example, I was a child. I was sitting on the front porch with my grandmother and my oldest nephew. And my oldest nephew had on a red shirt. And it was thundering hard. winds were whipping. You could hear the trees cracking. Lightning was striking. It was insane. And my grandmother just says, we got to turn off all the lights, and we need to change, we need to change little boy's shirt because the red is too aggressive. It's too much. We need some blue to calm things down, to calm the storm down, so we can listen to what God is saying. That ain't nowhere in the Bible, y'all. And I'm pretty sure there's plenty of you out there who had somebody in your family go, we got to turn off all the lights. It's thunderstorming. Right? We got to listen to what's going on. Like, I know someone else out there had a similar experience, right? And when you open your eyes to the spiritual implications of stories like that, you're awakened to the world of hoodoo. Okay. Thanks for staying with me so far into the podcast, cousin. If you have not subscribed yet, cousin, what are you doing? Why are you leaving me here by myself? Please come back, hang out with me, subscribe, follow, make sure that, we stay connected. I would appreciate it. Okay. So we're at the question and answers portion of the podcast. I only found one question I wanted to answer. I've got like a plethora of them sitting on my computer from all over the internet, but there was only one question I wanted to answer today. So, well, I guess we'll keep it kind of short. The question comes from Conjure Rootwork and Hoodoo on Reddit. The question is, help! I'm a black woman from the Caribbean, grew up in the Baptist church my whole life. Family is super Christian. I've been drawn to the occult ever since I did a paper on it in college about 10 years ago. In my country, these things are very much frowned upon. I have been drawn to hoodoo after some reading around, but I'm still unsure if it's okay to practice since I'm from the Caribbean. We have obia in my country, but everything is so secretive. Can you all help me to get in the right direction, please? Okay, so there would be an argument, I guess, as to whether or not this cousin from the Caribbean can practice hoodoo. When I say Black American, I'm talking about, from the enslaved people on the continent of America, specifically the United States, and then how it spread, because hoodoo did spread when people started moving. Even from escaping slaves in Harriet Tubman's time, I told you guys that she took people all the way up to Canada. So, if you were from Canada and you're telling me you're practicing hoodoo and, your family has been in Ontario for 1,000 million years, I would believe you, right? Because the practice moved, right? The practice moved to Detroit and moved to, to the West. Like it changes, it moves, it grows as blacks change, moved, and grow. So I guess the first question to be answered is, can this person from the Caribbean, can our Jamaican cousin or wherever they're from, practice hoodoo? Now, my response to you would be, it's definitely adjacent enough. The slaves coming to the U.S. soil are the same slaves from the same area that went to the Caribbean. So there's that. We do share that common ancestor. But it is a cultural thing. Just because I am a black person does not mean that I participate in Caribbean culture. Do you understand what I'm saying? Black American culture. I say specifically Black American and not African American because you can be from Africa one generation ago and now you're here in American soil and you're African American. When I say Black American, I'm talking about the people who can trace their lineage no further back than slavery, right? The ones who we ain't come over here, our peoples ain't come over here willingly. That's when I say Black American, that's who I'm talking about, like an ethnic group, not necessarily as a race, right? Where was I going with that? Right. So, yes, we're all black, but we don't all have the same experience culturally. And those spiritual practices grew differently and place to place. So that's why in the Caribbean there's obia, but in America there's hoodoo, right? I'm sure it's close, but it's not the same, right? So personally, if you wanted to learn, I would tell you to find somebody to help you get into the culture. That's what I would say. I would find someone in America, a pen pal, a cousin, a friend, whatever, who can show you American culture and Black American spiritual practices. I think that's the best way to go about it if you want to practice hoodoo. Now, that said, there's nothing stopping this cousin from picking up books. I have a whole podcast about different hoodoo books. There's nothing stopping them from doing that, and there's nothing stopping them technically from practicing hoodoo, because the information is online. The information was written down. I do think there was conversation on another hoodoo board talking about how hoodoo has been properly gatekept. People need to stop freaking out. And I kind of agree, because even though there's podcasts like mine, even though there are other hoodoos online who are practicing and telling you how they practice, even though it's been written down with Zora Neale Hurston and, so many other people, it's information that's hard to find. Like, if you don't know what you're looking for, if you don't find the right person to show you, you'll miss it. You know what I mean? So yeah, you're on the conjure boards. If you get answers telling you where to start, if you find someone willing to show you how to start, why not? I wouldn't be mad about it. To me, in my mind, you're a cousin. Right? And if my cousin needs help, I'm not going to leave him hanging. That said, though, I think that if you look at your family in the Caribbean and you look at the superstitions of the people in the Caribbean from where you're from, you will find that Obia is probably a little closer than you think. Cultural Obia, maybe not the Obia man or the Obia woman, the person you go to get the work done, but you'll find that the culture of it is a lot closer than you think. Okay, good luck to that cousin. I wish you the best. You did it. We reached the end. Thank you so much for joining me. I always appreciate you guys just for clicking, hanging out. I appreciate that a lot. Before I go, cousin, I want to let you know that you deserve the world. No matter how traditional, how modern you want to be, no matter whether you get your candles from the, international section in the grocery store, or you go to the hoodoo woman herself who poured it. Your practice is valid and it's good for you. So it is good. And if you call for your blessings, cousin, they will come to you. You have a great day, and I'll see you guys next time.